It's good to have you all here for Insight Chats 20. So we started it 3 years ago, and today it's a special occasion, 20th event. So yeah, it's good to have you all here on this fine day. We have a special guest today, Sam. We're going to talk all about why we should do less of research, and we should all just don't do our work, and that's it. So Sam is going to explain his thoughts about that. And yeah, let's start, Sam, with a little bit about you. Can you explain a little bit about your career, yourself, and stuff like that?
Sure. Well, thank you. First of all, thanks everyone for coming. Really excited to chat with you guys. So I, maybe like some of you in the insights world, didn't really plan on being in insights. I fell into it through various different jobs before. So I was very interested in behavioural science when I was at university, and I was doing French, so I ended up working in France for a year in Paris, and I had a job at Ogilvy Consulting in their behavioural science unit, which was really interesting. So I came back from there, finished my studies, and then got a job at a marketing science agency in London, which was a nice mix of behavioural science applied to marketing. And it was also quite cool because it was twinned, I'd say, with Ehrenberg Bass Institute, which you guys might have heard of, which is in Australia famous for Byron Sharp, how brands grow, marketing science thinking. So got a bit of exposure to that, and then joined a different agency, more classic quant research, spent a few years there, wanted a new challenge, and then ended up joining the Met Police, and I've been here for about 5 months. So research and insights has always been there to some extent, but it's just been quite nice having different specialties, different areas of focus throughout those years.
Before you ask anything, do you, when someone asks you now, where do you work, you say you work at police, and then
they stay quiet. Well, it's funny you say that, because on my first day I accidentally got given a lanyard that said police officer rather than police staff, which is what I am, and I did make the joke that I could go up to someone and say you're under arrest, and they probably would say fine, but I didn't. I didn't do that.
You didn't keep it.
Didn't keep it. It's at home, which I probably shouldn't say, but it's there if needed. So
not like this is on YouTube. Or
no, it's not. It's not going anywhere, is it? No.
So can you tell us a little bit about your work right now at the Met? What are you trying to achieve and stuff like that?
Yeah. So it's been a really interesting time to join, because there was a big restructure in the Met Comms and Engagement team, which is where I sit, about 2 years ago. So a lot of people left. Everyone is basically new, more or less. And before now, there's not really been any focus on insights and research, which I always thought was quite surprising given how big it is as an organisation. It's about 50,000 people in total. So I joined as the second insights person. Oh, wow. So a very small team, just me and someone else. And we've basically been building the insight function from the ground up, which has been really exciting, because it means you can just think about all these different questions and you can basically set the agenda. So do we need a brand tracker? If so, what should we do? Do we need a comms tracker? Again, if so, what should we do? So it's been really exciting from that perspective. It's also been slightly challenging, because you're trying to convince people that we do need an insight function, and some people are slightly less positive about that than others. So it's a bit of an internal challenge as well. But in terms of the role and the scope, it's really trying to, as I say, build that insight function to make the comms and engagement team more data-driven and more effective. So it's a lot of audience insights, a lot of comms tracking, and it's a lot of thinking about frameworks and evaluation frameworks that we can then make consistent and apply across the whole team. So it's been a really exciting first 5 or 6 months.
That's a fantastic challenge, though. It's like a startup within a large organization. So you mentioned proving yourself and proving your worth within, let's call it, other departments is key. What's the plan? What's the roadmap?
Well, big question. I mean, I'd say we're very much in the what I would call the build phase at the moment, which is nothing really exists, and we're trying to set everything up so it can exist. So the comms tracker I mentioned, for example, until now, the Met has not really been able to understand how its comms have landed with people. We have no insight around what people think about comms, or whether they remember them, which audiences are remembering them versus others. So a lot of quite basic stuff is just not really in place. So we're very much in this phase of trying to create that and trying to build that. I think in the next, let's say, 6 months, we'll hopefully have a few more measures in place, a few more trackers, a few more frameworks, a bit more consistency when it comes to the metrics we want to track. And I think going forward, it becomes a really exciting time of, okay, we've got all this data, what do we want to do with it? What new opportunities do we want to identify? Which audiences do we want to focus on? So I think for the time being, it's proving that the insight is valuable and proving that we can, through insights and surveys, tell people something new, which I think is really exciting. I think once we've got that, it's then thinking, okay, we've got this data, what can we can do with it? So I'm sure it will be a different challenge in 6 months' time versus now, but for the time being, it's been fun setting all this stuff up from zero.
It's building those strong foundations for the future. So
Exactly.
Trackers and so on.
Exactly that, yeah.
And what's the perception of Met Police in UK?
I don't know. I mean, genuinely, I've been like, what do you guys? Put your hands up if you think the Met is trustworthy as an organisation. It's mixed. I mean, it's probably reflective of London. I mean, I think the thing that I've really found is that it's unhelpful to talk about London. It's much more helpful to talk about boroughs because, for context, 32 boroughs in London, they look completely different demographically. They look completely different in terms of the crime that takes place. They also look completely different in terms of people's perceptions towards the police. So a borough like Richmond or Kingston or Merton in the southwest will be much more positive towards the police than a borough like Lambeth or Lewisham. So to answer that question, what do people think about the police? It really depends on who we're talking about, where they live, how old they are, what religion they are. All of these different demographic and geographical factors will influence that. And some of that is perception. People have views that are driven by what they see in the news or media narratives. Some of that, for good and bad, is driven by the experience. What's I think quite good but also quite bad is that luckily most people will never actually experience crime in their life. They will not really have to interact with an officer. They will not have to go through the victim process. It's a low proportion of people who do that, which is great because we don't want people experiencing crime, but it's also quite a challenge because it means that their whole view of the police is shaped by what they hear and what they see from other people and from news as well, which makes it quite a challenge because, as I'm sure you guys know, a lot of the media narratives are negative about the police, and you could argue they should be, but I think compared to a lot of consumer brands that I worked on before, an agency, that external narrative part is so much more powerful than the product, which again is a big challenge for us because it makes you think, okay, how do we shift perceptions if we can't actually contact physically these people? You can't actually use the product and we can't show them the product in a way that we could with a consumer brand. So it is a challenge, and there's definitely geographies and audiences where we need to focus on. But generally speaking, just to go back to your original question, most people do actually trust the police. In London, it's about 75% say that they trust the police. It's fewer people who say that they think the police are doing a good job, what you might call confidence. So there's a bit of a gap there, which is something we definitely need to work on. But generally speaking, people are trustworthy, and they, if they saw a police officer, they wouldn't run away, or they'd let them into their house, and that's, I think, a good thing, and that's been going up in the last few years, which is good as well.
Nice. And you said this is your first in-house role, right? So what have been the biggest differences that you've noticed from working agency side to now working in-house? Yeah,
it's a really interesting one. I mean, what I'd actually say on reflection is that it's been more similar than it has different. So I think, I don't know about you guys, but before I joined, I was often told there were a lot of differences between the two. It felt like agency world was here, client world was here. Agency was much more focused on probing the data, obviously working with lots of brands, you're getting into the detail, you're being very technical with different methodologies, whereas client side was more hands-off. It's more about people management, how to get things done internally. And I think that is true to some extent, but more or less the skills that I had agency side, the skills that I developed agency side have been the same skills that I'm using now. And that really comes down to analysing data, it comes down to creating a good, clear narrative with that data and presenting that to people who probably don't have that much knowledge of research or insights, and then using that to identify opportunities in the future. So that's what I'm doing now. It's what I was doing before, and partly because a lot of what we do is in-house, so we don't use that many agencies maybe compared to other clients, but I think that's why it feels actually quite similar and not that different. I think, if anything, a lot of the assumptions have been reversed, if that makes sense. So, for example, being at agency side, this might sound quite bad, but I always felt like I could, to some extent, hide behind the recommendations, because when you're an agency, your final product is really a presentation or a report, whatever it is, and it might be three recommendations about, let's say, how to make advertising more effectiveness or how this campaign has performed. And you could, based on the data you have, say something like, well, we need to use more humour in our comms, or we need to improve the prominence of the branding because it's not that clear to consumers. And that's fine when you're an agency, because that's it, that's what you've been asked to do. But if I did that now, I'd have whichever team I presented to immediately say, well, what do you mean use humour in comms? Should we do it in all our comms? Should it be this type of humour? What about a quite sensitive campaign? So that sense of being hands-on, as I mentioned, and thorough and really in the detail, I often thought, well, that's more of an agency thing than a client thing, but actually I found it's the other way around. So that's been quite interesting to feel like actually some of those assumptions and you could say myths about the two are not really true and a lot more similar than they are different.
You said there are only two of you in your team, right?
Yeah.
So how come you do you said now most of the stuff you do in-house, right? So it's quite a lot of work just for two of you. Do you plan to expand the team, or what's the?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the research work will be in-house. I mean, for the comms tracker that I mentioned, for example, we're doing that in-house in that we're writing the questionnaire in-house, the analysis in-house, but we're using an external panel for the sample, which we can't really get. I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that we can do it ourselves in-house, and I'm not for one second saying that agencies are worthless, but I think a lot of the time it's using agency because you don't have the skills, you don't have the time, and I think in this case there's a lot of stuff that we can do as a two. I know it's not many of us, but we can tackle quite a lot of the challenges ourselves. But we do rely on agencies for specific projects, for specific situations. But I think, given, as I'm sure lots of organisations, especially the Met, are quite budget constrained, I think where possible, we're thinking, well, if we can do it ourselves and we can control the process a bit more easily, especially if we're doing something in the future and we want to look back and compare, then we think, okay, let's do it ourselves. And so far it's been, fingers crossed, okay.
Amazing. So you mentioned you're doing a tracker survey, but are you utilising any other data sets, other public data sets within your research? Yeah,
so it's interesting that I always think the working at the Met is very easy from an insight perspective, but also quite difficult. And the reason I say it's easy is because if you think about the challenge or the audience, it's very narrowly constrained. It's 8 or 9 million people who live in London. We have amazing data about those, let's say, 8 or 9 million people, thanks to the census, which is one of the most, you could argue, for a research geek, impressive things you could ever imagine. It's like 2 million people covering every single part of the UK, and then within that London. So we can say in this borough we know exactly who these people are demographically, their age, their gender, their religion. We can break it down by even more detailed wards rather than boroughs. So huge level of insight that we can get to just publicly. And the other thing I always think is there's no sense of competition. When I was working agency side with a brand like Tesco or Just Eat, a lot of the challenges were, how do we prevent, let's say, Aldi or Lidl taking market share from us, whereas here, luckily, well, you could say unluckily, you've got no other choice. You've got the police, and that's it. So you don't have to worry about
no competition.
No competition, and also no geographical expansion. There's no, we're not going to be moving into China anytime soon. So there's all these questions that you used to have.
It's a good constraint.
That you don't. So I always think from that, it's really easy to understand who our audience is. We know loads about them, but I think, as I said, the challenge is then identifying, well, what do we do about it if the product, quote unquote, is actually very rare for most people. We can't use the product to influence people's perceptions. We've got to think about it from a comms perspective. But to your point, to other data sources and tools, we've got the census, which is massively helpful. We've got a big public survey run by the mayor's office, separate to us, who interview, I think, 20,000 people every year, asking about their experiences and perceptions about crime. There's the crime survey in England and Wales, which again is separate. So all of these amazing data sources means we have a great understanding of who we're talking to, but the challenge is, okay, how do we speak to them? How do we change these perceptions, which are extremely deep and ingrained, and have been passed down often through generations, really.
That's interesting. So that you have those foundational data sources, so census, the mayoral survey, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
You're creating your own tracker survey.
Yeah.
It's going to be ongoing going forward. But what is it that you're trying to solve? Like, what are the key questions being posed? Are they questions that you are asking yourself within your team that you think will bring value to the map? Or is someone else giving the questions over to you?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, as an organisation, I think the big focus is building trust and confidence within the public, and those are those two metrics I mentioned, so trust and then confidence. Do you think the police are doing a good job locally? And really all of the work the Met does is designed to do that. It's obviously a lot easier said than done, as I've described, but that's really the organisational focus. And within that, within our world, we're trying to reflect that in the work that we do. So thinking about, okay, from a comms perspective, what does drive trust and confidence? So from a, let's say, social media perspective, we're very active on different platforms, Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, for example. I hate to say the word content, but what content should we put out that will be most effective at driving trust and confidence? Does it depend on the audiences we're speaking to? Does it depend on their age, for example? Do older audiences expect to see something slightly different? Should those messages be more educational and informative, or should they be more based on what is body-worn video, which you might have seen, which is the videos that officers collect when they're arresting people, which can be quite gritty, but also, I think, quite powerful as a message to land. So there's all these different questions around comms and the ways we can use that to ladder up to these big trust and confidence challenges. But yeah, to your point, I think really everything is framed in our department as driving those two bits.
Nice. So it's a key metric of success, like a KPI, and you're providing strategic recommendations to channels, like social channels, to drive those metrics up. Yeah,
exactly. And I think, to be fair, one thing I hadn't appreciated when I joined is that within comms and engagement, which is this department I'm in, it's a lot more than social media. We've got a big press team, for example, which might sound obvious, but whenever you see, let's say, the Metropolitan Police has said XYZ in a newspaper article, for example, that is someone in my team responding to a journalist, for example. That doesn't come from anywhere. So all of those things shape people's perceptions, because quite often the best response is actually to not say anything because it's a sensitive subject and you shouldn't comment on that. And there's a big external relations team, so maybe less public facing to our audiences or to the public, but do a lot of work with different organisations like the Mayor's Office and the Home Office to make sure that the Met is being represented. There's a huge internal comms team as well. I think one really key insight for me is that talking about the product, the best way we can influence people's perceptions, at least from a product perspective, is the officers. And if the officers aren't happy and if they're demotivated, that's going to have a huge impact on how crime is considered and how arrests are made. So we need to make sure that internally people are happy and satisfied and we understand their challenges as well. So the internal comms becomes really important. So I think the trust and confidence piece is the key, but within that we've got so many different teams and different ways to do that. It's not a simple
Many levers.
Yeah, it's not just a simple put something out on LinkedIn and hope for the best.
Nice.
Okay, we can slightly switch to the part, why should we all do less of research? We are all interested in that part. Why should we do less of our work?
Yeah.
So can you explain us why should we do this?
Yes. Intentionally provocative, I think, as a statement, but something I stand by. So I think that we're often told research is about data collection and data analysis, and I think that's probably further from the truth than really anything else. I think the best research will always come from a mix of, yes, data analysis, but also things that have nothing to do with the data. That's strategic thinking, so how does data work within an organization or a business? It's creative inspiration. What do different brands in different sectors do? How do they approach the same challenges? I think it also comes just from a general curiosity about people and about brands. So much of it really is not to do with the data set at hand. So much of it comes from external thinking and looking outside the task at hand. And I've always felt it's quite odd because, at least when I was at an agency or agencies, it was always deemed as that extra add-on. It would be like, well, okay, you've got the data, go and analyse it, and maybe we can find some extra creative thinking as a little cherry on the cake. And I've always thought it should be the opposite. It should be the creative thinking, the strategic thinking, that is what drives what you're doing, and then the data should follow, but the data is almost secondary to some extent. And I've had so many experiences where that's just been confirmed. I mean, we did, for example, working at my last agency, we did a big piece of work with Tesco, where we were tracking all of their comms, and they came to us and said, we need a way of consistently evaluating comms in different areas. So massive brand, as you can imagine, they've got comms that goes out on their value range, on their quality range. They have seasonal comms like their Christmas campaigns, which you would have seen. And they had no really way of comparing like for like, are these comms doing well in each of these areas? I think it's probably not helped by the fact that, like so many comms trackers, it had a lot of metrics and not much meaning, you could say. So things like appeal, standout, what did it tell you something new? A lot of message perceptions were included in the survey, a lot of things like brand recognition, all of these different metrics, but no one really said, well, does it even matter if we're driving these things? So that was the ask, and it was a really interesting process going through that. We spent several months working with them, thinking about, okay, what should this framework look like? And it made me think, well, it's not really a question of how are Tesco's comms doing? It's really a question of, well, what does effective advertising look like in the first place? And to get to that, you can't just look at a data set. You need to look at things like psychology and how people process information. You need to look at wider category thinking, benchmarks. What does the latest thinking on attention look like? You need to think about brands who are doing this well, not so well. Everything you can get your hands on that is really not to do with the data set at hand. And I think that really just confirmed this idea that added thinking is not an add-on. It's a key part of research. And I think since then I've just had so many experiences where it's reminded me that the things that clients really like are not always the things they've asked for. It's not always the data set that you have been asked to look at. It's the little example, or it's the little
the golden nugget.
Yes, golden nugget, if you want to call it that they haven't seen before, because they're always focused on their own brand and they're not really looking at other brands, and that's why it's so important to do that. So when I say do less research, it's not do less work. I would never encourage you to do less work. It's more combine the research at hand with external thinking, with strategic thinking, and with creative inspiration from other brands and other sectors.
Quite like that approach, how you reversed it. So you're starting from the target or end result, like what is the actual problem at hand, and you trace it back. At which point can we actually move the dial?
Exactly, and I think it's a really good point, because I think as a researcher, I love research. I think research is really valuable, but I also think it can't answer everything. There's a lot of questions that research can't really help with, because you either can't collect the data, or it requires judgment and experience, which data can't replace. So I think that's why, exactly, if you reverse it, you think, okay, what do we really need to solve here? Do we need data? And if so, what data do we need, as opposed to thinking, which people quite often do, which is, well, let's just get data. I mean, even at the Met, I've had a lot of people say, oh, can we get data on X, Y, Z? And I've said, well, what for? They said, oh, we just need data. And it's not really that useful as an approach, because you're basically just collecting numbers for the sake of it, and it doesn't really tell you anything, or it doesn't really inform any decision that you're going to make.
I think that's another good point actually you make, is you can't answer every question. So it's good to know the things that are going to remain the black holes, and then the things you can actually find out or measurably move.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you're just collecting data for the sake of it, it doesn't really help anyone, because it's your time that's being spent. It's expensive to ask people in a survey. You get numbers which I think give the illusion of insight, but quite often they're just random digits that don't really tell you anything about the people, or in this case, the public.
So going back, what are your thoughts, like how do we end there when a certain team is just like asking for more research and data? Should the research team push back and like say to them, are you sure, like how does the research team respond, especially internally in-house, when you have your teams outside trying to ask for more of research? Like, what should be correct way of responding?
I don't know if there's a one correct way. I think it's always about explaining it in a nice, polite way, and not just saying no or yes. I think on occasion, if it's coming from quite a senior place, then you obviously need to give it slightly more consideration, and ideally you wouldn't do anything you don't think is right, but obviously on some occasions you need to almost play the game and accept that you're going to have to do something that you don't think is technically right. But I think generally it's that sounds bad.
I like how you politically speak all about this thing.
Yes, very
good.
Yeah, but I think generally it just comes from having a good, honest relationship with whoever it is, and if you've got a justification for doing or not doing research, or doing or not collecting data, then I think it should feel like a normal conversation. And to be fair, I've found so far at the Met that's usually been the case, and sometimes it actually leads to a better outcome if you have a discussion and they want certain data, and actually it makes you think, well, maybe we can't get this, but it does make me think, why don't we look at this in a slightly different way? Why don't we add a question on it in a comms tracker, for example? So I think that conversation doesn't have to be negative. It can actually lead to a new hypothesis that you want to test, and new insight down the line.
But it seems that you personally do have that framework of adding something special in, whether that's golden nugget, whatever else, to make that research more memorable, whether that's in a meeting room or in a presentation.
Yeah.
Maybe unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. So I mean, very much from an agency perspective, when I was
We spent too much time together.
It's very kind. When I was at my previous agency, I actually remember we worked a lot of work with Just Eat, the takeaway company, and we had a big multi-market brand tracker with them. And I actually remember, it really stuck out in my mind, one presentation on one of these markets. The person at Just Eat, after we presented, said, look, it's all fine, it's all good, but we've seen this data before. What we want you to give us, and what we've paid you to do, is to give us that thinking that we don't have, because we're focused on this brand the whole time. So that's always stuck in my mind, and it's always made me think that whenever I'm doing a presentation or a report, I always try and think, can I add something that has not been asked for, or can I add something external that will make this report not necessarily memorable, because that's not really the point, but make it more useful and make it more valuable. Because going back to that point I said earlier, the challenge is not really identifying the problem as much as thinking about how you can solve it. I think research is really good at telling you that, you know, this audience is less satisfied, or this comms isn't working as well, or these are the groups where we're falling behind. But it's a bit harder to then say, what should we do about it? Because that should question opens up a whole range of possibilities, and that's where you need the external inspiration and the creative thinking to think, okay, what should we do about it? Here's some solutions.
And I know you also share with me, it's really important to you to be creative in the research process as well. So how do you approach creativeness in research? Because there is also a lot of perception that the research are all geeks. You know, like, and there is not much creativeness inside our world, right? Like, so how do we show them they're wrong?
Yeah, no, I think it's a big. I think it's going back to what I said. There's big brand image problem with research, which is everyone thinks it's data collection and data mining and big Excels, and maybe for some people it is. But I think for me, the creative element can really come, or should come, throughout the whole process. So if I think about typical research journey, it will start with thinking about what to test and what questions to answer, and that's arguably where creativity is most important, because all data comes from the past. It can't really tell you what to look for in the future. That's why you need some judgment, or whatever you want to call it, creativity, to think, okay, I've noticed something interesting here, there's a slight discrepancy in this data. Should that be something we look at and explore in the future? So I think it definitely comes at the start. I think it comes when you're designing, let's say, a questionnaire. I think a lot of problems you see with research, and I think a lot of the negative press it has, at least in the marketing world, comes from quite bad research, quite poorly designed research, which you see quite a lot. You have stats like 90% of people are willing to pay more for a brand that is socially conscious, which you see quite a lot. And that's probably not true. It's probably because the way it's been asked is on a very simple scale, and everyone loves to agree with a scale. So even little things like that, where you think, okay, let's make it a bit more creative, maybe a trade-off question where people are asked to decide between socially conscious and, let's say, cost effective. You can even ask about, let's say, people's recent behavior. So rather than a hypothetical, what would you do? Actually, what have you done? All of that stuff, which sounds quite minor, I think really helps to get to a more accurate picture of what people think. So I think creativity is key there. And then when it comes to the analysis of research, again, really, really important in terms of how you cut the data, which audiences you look at. I always find it interesting when people say that the data says X, Y, Z, because the data doesn't say anything. You always have to speak for the data. It's not just sitting there telling you what it should say. You have to make it up for yourself. And then, as well as that, as I mentioned, the inspiration and the examples that you can find to complement the data, again, all come from creativity. So creativity might be I know it's a slightly difficult word to define, and it's got quite a lot of baggage around it. I think it's more just thinking these things through judgment and not just focusing solely on the data at hand, which as I say, can be useful throughout the whole process.
Nice. I think there's something about also it's like sticking the landing or presenting your findings.
100%.
Like you said, it's very subjective. I like what you've started doing with the Uncommon Thread project. So maybe you can just speak about that a little bit and how you have utilized those concepts in your findings.
Yeah, sure. So as I said, I think creative inspiration is absolutely key, and I've always tried to find that. And at the same time, I've always struggled to find creative inspiration. I've found that a lot of websites will give you an article like 10 best or worst rebrands, like 20 cool digital ads. Usually they're focused on the same set of brands like Nike and Google and Amazon. And I think crucially, the key thing that's missing for me is that all of these case study or example websites or databases are focused just on marketing. So it's very rare to get a resource that is focused on lots of other sectors. But when you think about it, marketing, I think, really is the business of understanding people. It's not just focused on specific brand buying elements. It's understanding how people think and behave. And for pretty much all of us, marketing is a very small part of our day-to-day life. We have a lot of behaviors and attitudes that exist outside of that, but that's never really reflected in the case study resources that we have. So I felt that was slightly frustrating, so I tried to do something about it. I've been collecting quite a lot of random examples that I've liked. I'm fairly active writing things on LinkedIn, writing articles, so I had a few examples to go on, and I thought, okay, I'll try and make it into something a bit more systematic, and I ended up building a website called Uncommon Thread, which is essentially a database that hopefully solves the problems I've discussed. So it's got about 700 examples on there at the moment, and the examples are categorized into a whole different range of sectors. So some from marketing, but sport, music, arts, politics, polling, a whole range of different sectors. And they are categorized into hopefully some interesting and original ways of thinking about the world. So it's none of the 10 worst brew brands and 10 best digital ads. It's hopefully some interesting ideas that you're not really thinking about accessing on a day-to-day basis. And the idea is to give people a tool that can then, when it comes to a pitch deck or when it comes to a presentation, give them exactly the sort of creativity that I was talking about and make their work slightly better. So as one example to make it a bit more concrete, one of the ideas or the categories is what I've called friction as a force for good. And I think quite often you hear that brands should make the world as seamless as possible, reduce all hassle factors when they're coming to designing things, but actually you can find quite a lot of examples of brands benefiting from doing the opposite, of adding a bit of difficulty into the process and standing out as a result. So that's the idea. And then I've got examples, yes, from consumer brands like Aldi and Costco, whose store layouts are actually notoriously difficult to navigate. Aldi has its quite famous Isle of Shame, where there's just a bundle of things in there that no one really understands, but makes people remember it. And I think the Facebook page has got like 1 million followers or something like that, which is interesting in itself. So you've got examples from the consumer world that illustrate that, but I've also got an example which is personally relevant for me on there, which is buying Glastonbury tickets. So if anyone has been through the unfortunate process of doing that, they'll know that until very recently, the process was very chaotic. It was manically trying to refresh a page so you could get onto the next step, and there was always a bit of a cult around it because it was very memorable and it was very, very hard to do. And I think last year, for the first time, they simplified the process. You were just assigned a random number in the queue, and based on a lottery, you either entered or you didn't. And it was interesting when that happened because, yes, it made things easier, but it also made things a bit less memorable and a bit less different. So that element of friction that they removed actually, you could say, made the experience a bit less fun. So that's just one example of an idea that can be illustrated in lots of different ways, not just from marketing, but from music and a whole range of other sectors. So that's the idea, is to give people some interesting ways of looking at the world and some ideas that exist not just in the world of marketing, but a range of other sectors to show how it happens.
So when you're not resting, you have this side gig.
Exactly that. Very busy resting.
When do you have enough time to do?
It's a good question. I mean, as I say, I've been collecting. I say collecting like their Pokemon cards. I've been looking at this stuff for a while. So I've got a very boring but big document with a lot of these examples in. And whenever I find something interesting, I just add to that. So a lot of the work has been done before, and then when it comes to adding these examples in, I just find them and think about them. So I've got a weekly newsletter that goes out with 3 of those examples each week. So it's fairly straightforward just to add from what I've got and share them. But I think it's just, for me, it's again a massive reminder as to why it's important to think outside the box and to read around, not just focus on work, because there's very much a limit to what you can find out just from the job at hand, and all of these examples come from different sources, a lot of good Twitter threads, Reddit threads, all these different areas that just sometimes worth a real investigation, and over time you start to build up something quite cool. So that's it really.
Okay, shortly we're going to turn to Q&A. Before that, do you have a favorite example?
From the website?
Yes.
I mean, example I quite like, a few examples, but one of the ideas on there is selfish innovation, and that's the idea that people say it's very hard to innovate and where do you get good ideas from, etc., but it's actually very easy. One good way of innovating is just looking at your own personal problems. So it's the easiest source you can imagine, which is just you and your own frustrations. And the reason I like that is because you can see illustrations of that from so many different places. So one maybe more relatable example is Deliveroo, whose founder started the company because he was an investment banker working late nights in the city, didn't have any good food, thought, okay, I'm going to do something about this, started Deliveroo. So that feels quite relatable. But then you can actually find examples from places like Jerry Seinfeld, who's a comedian, famous for Seinfeld, the show. And when you listen to him in interviews, he says all the material just came from him thinking, what makes me really sick? What am I bored of? And that went into the show. You can even go back to the 1500s when Henry VIII basically wanted to divorce his wife. Catholic Church wouldn't let him, and so he started the Church of England. So we've only really got the Church of England because of one man's personal problems. So it's interesting. I always love that link between different categories, different areas, different generations, and to find that the same idea has been used or has been noticeable across all of them. So that would probably be my number one.
The last one is really good one.
Yeah.
Okay, do you have any questions for Sam?
Yes. I found it funny what you were saying about how the Met has no competition. So the usual reasons that a company with research don't hold for the Met. I guess the question is like, why have they started to care suddenly? By hiring you and maybe hiring more people, focusing more, why have they started to care about that perception in a way they never used to? I guess as it like connected to that question is, how have you like justified the value of the work internally? So have you had to change the story of why it's valuable? Because I've never worked in-house, so like have you had to change the story to justify the worth of the work you're doing?
So I think the answer to the first one is in my head is very much from the top, because we've got a commissioner, Mark Rowley, who I think joined in 2022, and from what I can tell, not that I was there at that point, he has very much transformed the organisation, transformed the focus of it. I think he's got a PhD in maths, is what I'm always told, which would make his focus on insights quite sensible. But I think there's a general sense within the comms engagement team that it needs to be more data-driven and more focused on what people think and not assumptions. So I think it's probably just coming from top down. Here's what we should do, which was obviously great for us and great for me because I wouldn't have been here without that. In answer to the second question, have we had to change a story internally? I don't think so, to be honest. I think as I said at the beginning, there's a challenge because some people are more convinced of insights than others. There's some people who I mentioned are desperate for data, constantly saying, can we have this in a survey? Can we look at this? Which is great because there's a real appetite among those people. I think that there are some people, especially in an organisation like the police, who think that the job is getting out there and arresting people, and me making a report saying that trust has gone up in a certain place is not really doing much. Actually, we need to invest more time doing the stuff that matters, to which I'd say that obviously that is important, but research can tell you how to do that stuff more effectively and how to identify the people we need to target more effectively. I think especially in an organisation like the police, actually that becomes even more important because it is so complex and it's so much going on and there's so many different divisions and departments. I think having a centralised, you could call it source of truth, is absolutely key. So I think to that point, I think that it's not so much changing narratives, it's more just demonstrating the value of insights and showing that it can make the work better and make the experience for the public better. So I think linking it to those foundational objectives is always key.
Any other questions? Yes.
How do you deal with data that's so biased? Because when people ask questions like, for example, do you buy frozen fruit or fresh fruit? People don't have like an emotional reaction to it. But obviously when you ask direct questions about, for example, the police, there's always a kind of sentiment behind it. So how do you deal with that when you analyse the data? So
I actually think that it's a bit easier doing this than it was when I was at agencies, because I'd say it's quite a high involvement category compared to other ones. So if you're asking about, I don't know, like frozen food, for example, I'd imagine people don't really know how often they buy that, and they genuinely don't know which brand they buy. A lot of food that people find in cupboards is completely random. They have no idea. So I think actually that's where it's slightly harder, is when you're asking about things that people don't really know the answer to. I think when it comes to the police, yes, there is an element of emotion and of potentially sentimentality, whether that's good or bad. But I think what we're asking is very much perception-based and is less behaviour-based, which again makes it easy because we're not asking people to remember what happened to you a year ago or did you buy this. We're asking people what they think in a given moment about the police, which again I think makes it easier. So I'd actually say it's a slightly easier job from an insight perspective and a data collection perspective than it has been at agencies where I've been working with brands that people, for the most part, don't really know or don't really have much attachment to.
Do we have any other questions? Yes.
I was thinking actually about the kind of role of data in things like broken window theory. Well, I think there's a debate about how accurate that was now, isn't there? But clearly data gathered there was used to change methods of policing. I was just curious about whether you've seen any examples of good application of insight or bad applications of it in other countries in relation to policing as well, or whether you feel like you're blazing a bit of a trail in terms of what you're doing here in the UK.
It's a really good question. I think the honest answer is I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen anything that useful. I think the most useful stuff often comes from academics who are not employed by the police but who work on police-related matters. So there's ongoing projects I think that Beck are doing around crime hotspots in London and trying to map exactly where those crimes take place. I think going back to that point I said about borough variation, if you look at the recorded crime stats, Westminster and specifically Soho account for a huge chunk of that because it's a lot of, so don't get your phone out there would be my advice, it's a lot of tourists who get their phone out and phone theft is through the roof. So there's some, I think, quite interesting big data stuff going on, usually from academics. In terms of other police forces, I mean, I think that the Met is the second biggest police force in the world after the NYPD, and it's definitely the biggest in England. And from what I can understand, I think the comms engagement team and the focus on that is much bigger here than you'd ever get in a let's say the Thames Valley Police Force or any other. So I think insights is probably not actually that common outside of the Met. If we're a team of two, you can imagine what it's going to be like in a smaller police force, probably non-existent. So from what I've seen, probably not loads of, not saying we're doing everything perfectly, there's probably not loads of other examples, but it's usually academics who have some quite interesting stuff on that.
Okay, I think we're good. Okay, one more.
One more. Hopefully it's a nice one. It seems like you've been on quite the journey as to where you are now. So my question is, what has been the best piece of advice that has helped you navigate your career?
Oh wow, what a question. The best piece of advice I would say is, I think one that I got actually on my first day of my work in Paris, which I mentioned at Ogilvy, which my brother sent me a slide deck about I think creative strategy, and it was advice for creative strategists on their first day. Not that I was one, but it ended up being really useful. And one of the bits in that was just treat every day like it's day one, which I think might have been a Jeff Bezos quote or an idea that he's had. And it's really stuck with me because quite often you can, I think, just relax into a job, and once you're there for a bit of time you feel comfortable and you stop having that day one mentality of I'm going to do everything, I'm going to be really helpful, really proactive, try and do the best job I can. And I think it's really helpful to have that as you go along, because it especially in research, it constantly forces you to think, how am I going to be proactive? What am I going to do with this data? What new things am I going to find out that we don't already know? As opposed to just waiting for people, let's say internally, to come to you and say, can we have a look at this data? Which is very easy to do, but I think that I say day one approach, it's a bit corny, but makes you think, okay, let's find out something new, let's approach it like I need to impress everyone in the room and no one knows who I am. So that's always stuck with me, so I presume if it's stuck with me after that amount of time, it's probably not too bad.
Good. On that note, we are going to close for tonight. Sam, thank you so much. It was great.